My name is Todd Miranda, and if you're here to learn about JQuery Selectors, you're in the right place. We're going to talk about JQuery Selectors, how to use them, a little bit of optimization for JQuery Selectors. If you've been using JQuery, you've been using selectors. Selectors are how we get access to the particular elements that we want to act upon. You've probably been using some standard selectors that you use a lot. Maybe there's some other selectors you've used because you've copied and pasted, but you really weren't sure how they worked or why they worked the way they worked. And there may be some selectors that you haven't even seen or don't even know are there. So my goal today is to really give you an overview of what I think are some of the important selectors that you really could use on a day-to-day basis. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to optimize some of those selectors and how to optimize just your selector kind of approach in general. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Selectors really came from CSS. So our JavaScript selectors started in CSS with CSS selectors. And if you look at the kind of the core definition of a selector for CSS, it is effectively a pattern matching rule, which makes sense. It's a rule that's going to match a particular pattern in our DOM that determines which style rules apply to elements in the document tree. So we're going to list a bunch of style rules, and then we're going to attach these pattern matching rules to those styles, and the pattern matching rules will tell us where the styles apply. So here's some CSS selectors that you've probably seen something similar to this. We have a header tag. So that's an element selector in CSS. We're actually utilizing an element as our selector pattern, and that element happens to be an H2, the header 2 tag. Then I'm sure you've used an ID selector, which is prefixed with a pound sign. So here we have our pound main content, and that's to select any element that has an ID of main content. That's how we specify our ID selector. Next down you see we've got a class selector, which is prefixed with the period. So a class selector matches whatever element has that class associated to it or applied to it. And then you see a combination of element selectors and a hierarchical selector. So in this case we have a div, so we're going to find a div that contains a paragraph that has a style or has a class of big. So you see div space p.big. So that's a hierarchical selector where we've selected a hierarchical pattern starting with div and then going into the div and getting a p that has a class of big. So obviously these are things that when you look at it, you've been using selectors for a while if you've been doing any kind of web development. So the jQuery and other JavaScript libraries use selector engines to take the pattern rule, the pattern that you pass in, the selector that you pass in, and it effectively parses that out and then does whatever it needs to do to search through the DOM to find and identify and find that element. So that's the job of the selector engine. And the selector engine is really nothing new. Selector engines have been around for a while, and there's lots of different kinds. There's lots of different selector engines that have been out for a while. Some of them have matured. Some of them are fairly new. For instance, selector.js. Sizzle. Now, Sizzle is one of importance to us in particular because Sizzle is the selector engine that is currently used in the jQuery library. And Sizzle was introduced in the jQuery library, I believe in version 1.4.1 of the jQuery library. It was version 1.4 of the jQuery library. They introduced Sizzle as the selector engine. jQuery had its own selector engine, and Sizzle was coming along, doing a really good job, so they thought that they would include Sizzle as the selector engine jQuery. And the fact that we switched to Sizzle actually plays an important part that we'll get to a little bit later in optimization. YUI has a selector engine. It's just a JavaScript library. Peppy is another selector engine. MooTools has a selector engine. NW Matcher, and finally another one you may be familiar with is EXTJS, has a selector engine as well. So these selector engines again are just responsible for parsing out the selector that you give it and then being able to search through the DOM, identify and retrieve the element or elements that you wanted based on that selector. So there's various types of selectors. We've got just regular old selectors. Some examples of those are our ID selector, which we've looked at, our element or class selector. We have here an element selector with some attribute filters on it, and then another element selector, our table. Another type of selector is our selector method, and these examples of these are .find, where you pass in a selector into the find method, and then .eq, which returns a particular indexed element in a result set of finds. Selector filters, and some examples of that are :eq, very similar to the .eq selector method, the :first, and :input. So the difference between selector filters and selector methods, not only in the way that they're applied to your selector, but also the way they look. The colon is typically your selector filter, where the selector methods are a dot, just like in jQuery where you're going to have a dot, some kind of method. And last but definitely not least is a type of selector that you may not have even known you could do, but you will before this presentation's over with: custom selector filters. So we can write our own custom selector filter, which is really cool. We can do some very specific things, kind of specific to our application. For example, we could write a favorites custom selector filter, and this would select all the favorites in a particular web page in our web app. Or we could write a news custom selector filter that would return all the news elements in our web page. Now, in those particular examples, you may realize that in that case you might have to have some knowledge of the web page in order to write that filter, because favorites is not necessarily a global concept as far as how a favorite would be written or what a favorite would look like or how it would even be implemented. News the same way, but there are some custom selector filters that are just more generic that we can use for any particular means, and we'll look at one of those a little bit later as well. So let's dive into all of our types of selectors, and let's take a look at each one of these, how they work, what they look like. Now, in order to do this, I think the best way to do this is kind of jump back and forth a little bit. We're going to kind of go back and forth. We're going to go from our presentation. We're going to go into a code file, and then we're going to jump back and forth between code and the browser, because I want to not only look at what this selector looks like in code, but then I want to see what the effect of that selector is. I think it's one of the best ways to really learn selectors. It's just to effectively play. Go through and say, let's see what this selector does. Let's try to understand why it does that so we get a better understanding of the selectors in general. So we're going to start off with just selectors. We've got basic selectors, which are things like our class selectors, ID selectors, elements. We got element selectors, which obviously are things like a, div, h1 or hx, table, any particular element that we can specify directly. Attribute selectors, which are in square brackets. They allow us to say that we want to pick an element that has an attribute with a particular value that looks like this. So those are attribute selectors. We'll take a look at those. And finally, multi-selectors, which is really just a combination of all the above. It allows us to say, I want to select an element or a group of elements that either applies to or matches this particular selector or that particular selector or another particular selector, and kind of put all those together in one selector statement. Let's go ahead and jump into code, and we'll take a look at some of our selectors, our selector types. Now, I put together a relatively simple web page. I tried to be somewhat pseudo-realistic in the web page. Here's what the web page looks like. So we have a header. We've got some navigation elements here. We've got some page that has some content in it, and these are elements. Again, this is pseudo-realistic because the structure of the page is fairly realistic. Got a footer. But within the page itself, we just have a grouping of elements that we can act upon. I've got some divs and some spans, some paragraphs, some lists, I've got some input elements, and that way through this presentation we'll be able to act upon these elements and see how our code affects them. And in our code, I'm not going to go through here very much. We're including the JQuery 1.6.2 minified version. I've just got a reset style sheet, and then I've got a site style sheet just to lay out some styles for the page and the overall layout of the page. We're actually going to do inline styles in most of our functions here. And I've just got a little function block set up in a script ready for us to put some code in here. This is how we'll run our selectors, and this will just run on page startup. So this is just kind of a good framework to be able to use to test a lot of our selectors. So let's begin with just a basic selector. And this is going to use a class selector. So we've got our period and then the class name. And we're going to this is the selector here. We're going to use the JQuery selector to select that, and we're going to just apply some CSS to it. We're going to create a solid red border around it. Now let's look down in our page and let's kind of see what we would anticipate this would find. Down in our page we have some divs here, some container divs if you want to call them that, and then we've got some divs here. Notice class, I've got all of them have this basic one class, and then there's some various other class. Here's a my class and a my class. So we would anticipate that selector might find these elements. So let's save that. We're going to go back to our page. Now notice what I've done here is in these blocks I've actually written the class name. That's the primary class name for those elements, and I've written what type of element it is, whether it's a div or a span. So we're going to refresh the page, and notice that our two divs that had classes of my class now have our border around it. So fairly simple, fairly straightforward selector. We simply said find everything that has a class of my class and apply our particular CSS to that. So let's go up here and let's take a look at an ID selector and perhaps some hierarchy as well. We're going to look for an ID of block container and then divs within that block container. So here's our ID and element, and we're going to apply a style to it. Let's go back over to our site. We'll refresh that. We need to save our file first. Go back over and refresh it. So now you can see that we've created some background color for anything that was in our background container, which was a container div that was a div, and it found all three of the divs. It left the spans out. All right, so again, a fairly basic selector, but really shows not only hierarchical selectors but also shows the use of an ID selector and an element selector together. Let's take this a step further and let's look at an attribute selector. So we're going to keep kind of the same structure here. We've got our block container ID and then divs within that. But then for each one of those divs, we want to look for a div that has an attribute called data-item ID that is equal to 67. Let's go down and look at our code. And you'll see that here's our divs and our spans. Some of them have titles, some of them have this data-item ID attribute. One of them has a value of 1, 2, 3, and one of them has a value of 67. So we anticipate that this is the div that will be selected by our selector. Block container div where the attribute data-item ID is equal to 67. We'll refresh that. And there we are. So that particular div is the one that's selected, and we applied a blue color to our background. Now, having the equal sign is not the only thing that we can do with our attributes. There are other operators besides equals. Let's take a look at one of those. This is our contains operator. So we're effectively going to go with the same pattern again. Change it up a little bit to say where the div has an attribute title that contains, that's our asterisk equals, the string di. Now, this is case sensitive. So let's look down. Again, we're going to kind of investigate this a little bit. Here's our titles. This one has first div, which is DI, second div, which is DI, and last div, DI. So I see 3 of them that should be selected by our selector. So let's save this. We'll switch back over to our browser and refresh that. And here is our divs that have been, what we did was change the height. They stand out a little bit. And you can see that we've got 2 of those selected. And I had said 3 of them, but I had forgotten that this other one is a span, not a div. So we've got our 2 divs that contain DI. Now, just to kind of prove, if we change that to a lowercase d, and we switch back over to our browser and refresh, all right, it's not going to find anything. So we lose our selections, and that's because it is case sensitive. So that's something to keep in mind. We want that to be case sensitive. So this is our contains operator. Another operator that we can look at is our begins with operator. So this time we're going to do an example where we say a block container, and I want you to grab we're going to use the global operator. This is something you don't want to do. For cases of the presentation, I'm going to go ahead and use this, but you really want to steer clear from both either an explicit or an implicit global, and that's pretty important. One of the things we need to keep in mind is what happens in certain cases is we get an implicit global. You want to stay away from that because this effectively overrides a lot of the parts of our selector and says, you know what, look at the entire DOM. I don't want you to kind of filter it down by certain elements. I want you to look at everything globally. So just decide from a performance standpoint, from an optimization standpoint, really you want to typically avoid the global scope. So we're going to say where title begins with last. Again, case sensitive. I'm going to save that. Let's go back over to our browser and we'll refresh. And we get this last element here expanded. So that's our span. Notice it's a span, which is we didn't use div here. We used kind of global. We could go back to using div, or we could change this to a span, and that would be better than using the asterisk, which again means a global scope. But this operator here is our begins with operator. There's other operators besides these 2, but we're not going to go through every single operator. You can look up the other operators that exist for the attribute selectors. But that gives you a couple ideas of attribute selectors. All right, we've looked at everything now that we wanted to look at except for our multi-selector. So let's take a look at a multi-selector. Here is our selector, and we're going to look for anything that has a myClass style, or myClass class, or a not myClass class, or a hierarchical selector, which is block container followed by div. All right, each one of these is separated by a comma, and that's how we do our multi-selectors. We just put multiple selectors in our selector block separated by commas. Fairly straightforward. Let's go back over to our browser and refresh. And you see that we've got a wider div for all of these except for the last one. So we've selected all of these elements here with our multi-selector. Things that had not my class, things that had class, and this was a div. This is a span with another class, so it doesn't fit any of our multiple selectors that we had in our selector block. So hopefully that makes sense from the selector standpoint. Let's go and let's take a look at some selector methods. So selector methods can be either traversal methods, really, are typically what selector methods are also referred to as traversal methods, because we're going to create a selector pattern and then we're going to kind of traverse the DOM from there. So traversal methods is another name for this. And we have filters and tree traversal methods. So the filter methods look a little bit like .filter, .eq, .first, .has, and .slice. Slice is pretty interesting. We're going to take a look at that one. It's an oft forgotten filter. And then tree traversal selector methods, things like closest, children, find. So there's a few examples. Let's take a look at some of these in action. Let's go back over to our code. First, let's take a look at a children. Alright, so here's a children filter selector method. We're going to select the block container ID, so any element that has an ID of block container, and then on the result of that, we're going to do .children, so that's going to return the children of these results, and we're going to apply a background to that. So let's save that, and let's just jump over right away to the page here, and let's see what that looks like. Alright, so as you can see, it selected all the children of our block container element. So let's look back at the code just to refresh your memory. Here's our block container div, and we wanted to pull all block containers, which there happens to be only one, this one, and then we wanted to pull its children. So we pulled all of these elements here, and we styled them, and that's the resultant. So again, that one is fairly straightforward, fairly simple. We simply looked at all the children on the resulting return from our ID selector. Now let's take a look at another example of children. Here's a children where we're passing in a selector into the children method. So we're going to start off and we're going to look for everything that has an ID of block container. Then we're going to look at its children where they match this selector, which is an element of div. Alright, and we're going to style those. So let's save that, go over to our page, and see what difference that makes. As you would expect, it found all the children that were divs, so it left out the two spans. So fairly straightforward. One of the things that you're going to see as we start to use some of these and we go back and forth is it's really important to understand how the selectors that you're using and how the filters and everything work. Because there's going to be some that we're going to get to and it's going to be, I understand how that should work, and you might be a little surprised by the result. And then we'll talk a little bit about why it works the way it works. So it's important to read the documentation around the selectors, understand how the selectors work before and while and even after you're using them. So let's go to another type of selector method. We'll look at the EQ method. Now, EQ method is interesting because it allows you to specify an index for the element that you want to pull out of the resulting set. So let's see what we've got here. We're going to pull all elements that have an ID of block container. Then for each one of those, we're going to pull their children. And then in that result, we're going to pull the second indexed element from that. All right, so that's what .eq does. And then we're going to apply a style to it. So we'll save that. Let's go back here. We'll load our page. And here is our second indexed element from children. So here's our block container, which obviously is not styled so you don't see it, but then we went and we grabbed all of its children, which are all of these. We saw that applied earlier, and then we grabbed the second indexed value, which is 0, 1, 2. This is a zero based index. Now there is a situation where we don't use zero based. There's one example, we'll take a look at that. But for the most part, jQuery selectors or JavaScript selectors use a zero-based index value. So in this case, we specified the index of 2, so that's 0, 1, and 2. So we pulled the third element, which is the element that has the index of 2. So that's how we use EQ. Now let's take a look at first, which is one that you will probably use pretty often. So here's a pattern that we're going to follow. We're going to find the block container and then the divs within that block container. So block container div is our pattern we're going to look for first. Then we're going to do .first. So we're going to return the first one of those and we're going to apply a style to that. So let's go back here, refresh our page. And as we would expect, it's the first element in our resulting the elements that matched our pattern. We got the first one, we applied a style to it. So .first works like we would expect to here. We're going to look at a first filter a little bit later, and it might not behave exactly the way you would imagine. We'll talk a little bit about why it might be a little different. But here, pretty straightforward. We find some elements that match our pattern. We're going to grab the first one and apply a style to it. Let's take a look at a little bit more interesting one, the .has. So in this case, where we're going to use this is we're going to look at our list of paragraphs here. So we've got these paragraphs in our page, and you'll notice that some of them have spans in them, some of them have more than one span, and then some of them don't have spans at all. So that's the structure that we're working with. Let's look at our selector. We're going to select all paragraph elements that has a span element, and then we're going to apply a style. So let's go back over our code, refresh. Okay, now hopefully you can see that these paragraphs have now been, their text has been set to red. So we grabbed all the paragraphs that have spans in them. This is the only one that doesn't. And we applied the style to the paragraph. And that's an important key here, is we're selecting the paragraph that has spans and applying the style. We're not applying the style to the span, we're applying the style to the paragraph that has spans. Again, kind of important to know how that selector works. Now let's take a look. I said earlier that we were going to look at this slice, and I think slice is kind of interesting. Slice, somewhat like EQ, works with indexes. We're going to find all block container IDs, and then we're going to grab their children. So we've done this before. We've seen this selector before. Now we're going to grab a slice of those, and we're going to grab the slice from 2 to 4 of the children of the block container. So let's save this and let's go and see what that looks like. Alright, so we grabbed all the children of our block container that were divs, and we grabbed slice from index 2 to 4. So here's our 0, 1, 2, and 3. So between 2 and 3 we grabbed those two elements, and those are the ones that were selected from our slice. Now, if we remove the second argument from slice and just specify the first argument, then the difference is it will find everything from the second index on. So the second argument is optional. The second argument further limits what we select, but if we just specify a first index value in slice, the first argument to slice, we're going to grab everything from that index on. All right, so we can put that back, and again, just to show everything between 2 and 4, and there we have it. All right, last but not least, within the selector methods idea, let's look at .find. Now, earlier we did a paragraph. We found all paragraphs that has span, and we added a class to it. This time we're going to find all the paragraphs, then we're going to find the spans, and then we're going to add a class. So, where do you think the class will be applied? At the paragraph or the span? Let's take a look. That's right, at the span. So again, we didn't, when we said .has, we were saying find the paragraphs that have a span. Using find, we said find the paragraphs, and then within that scope, find all the spans and add a class. So that's the subtle difference between those. Again, you'll hear me say this over and over again. Important to understand how these selectors work, because you can get results that you didn't expect if you are really not paying attention. They don't all necessarily work exactly the same way. So let's go back over and let's take a look at the next thing, selector filters. And these are kind of interesting. I think we're going to see a few things in selector filters that might not necessarily be exactly what we had anticipated. So here's some selector filters. There's extensions and form selectors. So those are the types of things that we're going to see in filters, are extensions and then form selectors. So the form selectors are things like :checkbox. It's going to find all checkboxes. :input will find all inputs. Now this is interesting. The :input here will find all inputs, not all input elements, but all inputs, which includes checkboxes, selects, and all the regular input. So that's not the input element, that's an input filter, and it'll find all types of inputs. Colon focus, which finds things that have focus. Colon header, colon password. So these find form elements effectively using filters. And then we've got basic select filters, things like even, find all the even things. The first, which again, we saw a selector method first. We'll see the selector filter first and how it differs. A colon not, which is effectively saying find me things that don't match this particular pattern. And then we've got child selector filters, where we've got first child and nth child are examples of that. We've got content selector filters, where we can do things like where something contains some pattern, where it's empty, and then has. We've seen the has selector method. We'll see that we also have the has selector filter here. Visibility, we can look at whether something is hidden or visible using the selector filters. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our code. We'll look at some examples of these. The first one we're going to look at is the not, which is kind of interesting to be able to negate our pattern. So here we're going to look for all list elements. Let's go down and look what we've got here. In our nav section, we've got a UL for unordered list, and we've got a couple of LIs here. One of them has a class login, and the others don't have any classes assigned. So here we're going to say find all the list elements, list items, where they are not contain the pattern login. So let's save this, and we'll go over to our browser and refresh. Alright, so here's our nav elements. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 nav elements, and obviously we've selected all of them except for the one that had the login class applied. So we selected all the LIs where they were not .login. So that's a good way to negate. If you can't find a way to select everything except one, then you can use the not to just rule that one out. Alright, we mentioned that we had an even filter as well. So let's take a look at the even here. We're going to look at the block container and then divs, and we want the even divs. Notice where even is applied. It even is applied on the div. So we're going to find all the ID block containers and then all their children that are divs and just the even ones, and we're going to style those. So let's run over to our browser again. Alright, so again, these are the even ones. Keep in mind that this is a span. So here's a div, here's a div, here's a div, and we chose the first one, skipped one, the next one, we would have skipped them. So this was all the even div children of the block container. Alright, so even is pretty nice. There's also an odd as well. So both an even and an odd. Now let's take a look at what I think is an interesting one. Block container colon first child. So our first child filter. So we're going to find block container, the first child, and then set a style on it. Alright, so can you imagine what this is going to select? Let's go back over to our site. Before I refresh this, remember here's our block container. It's not styled, so it just contains all of these elements. We did ID block container colon first child. All right, I'm going to refresh the page. Okay, so what is styled here is our block container. So that is probably not what you expected to see. We did block container first child. You would probably think that it would select the first child of block container, which would be this first div. But that's not how the colon first child works. One thing to note, the first child and nth child filters also use kind of the CSS selector style. And the reason why that's different is because they actually use a 1-based index as opposed to a 0-based index. So first child in that case is effectively the same thing as nth child, where you pass in a 1, not a 0. So it's 1-based only in the case of first child and nth child, and everything else uses kind of the JavaScript format, which is going to be your 0-based index. So another kind of small difference in the way that they work. Now let's talk a little bit again about how this first child actually functions. If you read the documentation on jQuery, the first child filter actually returns the first child of the parent of the matched element. So in this case, our matched element was ID block container, and it doesn't read exactly like that, but that's effectively what it's saying, is that the first child returns the first child of the parent of the matched containers, of the matched elements. So you're looking for a set of elements, and then you want to get the first child, which means it's going to go to the parent and say, of those, what is the first child of their parent? So in this case, block container, we found one block container, it's this, and we chose first child. So it's going to say, here's of this element, what's the first child of their parent? The parent is here, and the first child is itself. All right, so it might be a little confusing. Go read the documentation. You may have to read it 2 or 3 times of first child, and you'll see that effectively what it's saying is just that. Of the elements that we find, what is the first child element of those? All right, it's not saying what is the first child within that element. It's saying what is the first child of those elements. In order to be a child, there has to be a parent. So this is going to say, of all these, which is the first child? And since we only found one, there's only one of them. So that's what first child does. Again, very important that you understand how your selectors work, because that's one that you probably would not have expected. Now you might have if you had read the jQuery documentation, but if you did not read it and you just found first child and went, oh, okay, that's what I want to use, that might not actually return the elements that you think it does. So some of them can be a little confusing. Let's take another example of first child. Here we're going to say, and this one probably, now that we've explained that, this one probably makes a little more sense. We're going to find the block container and then the div, and we're going to put first child on the div. All right. So of the elements that match this in our div, what's the first child? Now that you understand how first child works, this might make a little more sense. And it might also be what you're expecting the first one to return. So we said find all the divs that were part of the block container and do the first child, which amongst all of these, the first child is this one. It's the first one. So now that we understand how first child works, that probably makes a little more sense. I mentioned nth child earlier. Let's take a look at nth child. So I'm going to come in. I also said that first child was very similar to nth child. So div nth child 1 should, based on what I said earlier, return the same thing when I refresh, and it does. All right, so it finds the same element. So if I were to come in here and say nth child 2, and then reload, all right, there's the second one, and I could do nth child 3. Notice it's div nth child 3. All right, interesting. Nothing is selected, but we saw that when we specified a 1, 1 was selected. When we specified 2, 2 was selected. When we specified 3, considering that it was nth child on a div, we would have expected the third div to be selected. All right. Another thing that might not necessarily be straightforward unless you've read the documentation on this is that the nth child filters actually look at all children. It does not take into account your filter for that. So nth child says for the divs, where the divs are located, look at all the children and do the third one. All right, so here's all the children, do the third one, but it didn't apply the style because the third element in the list is not a div, it's a span. All right, so let's look at that again. Find all the ID divs, do the nth child on it, and specify the third child. All right, but it's a div. So nth child will look at all children, regardless of what they are. It's going to grab the third one, but the third one is not a div, so it doesn't match, so it won't style it. All right, so the thing to remember there is that nth child, whoops, don't want to do that. Nth child actually looks, from an nth child perspective, actually looks at all the children, but then when it finds the indexed one, it's going to make sure that it matches, and in this case it doesn't, because the third one is a span, not a div. All right, another one that definitely is not something that you would expect if you hadn't read the documentation on the nth child filter. Okay, let's get back to something a little more normal, something that you might expect a little bit better. We're going to find all paragraphs, and then when we find those paragraphs, we're going to find span, and we're going to apply the first filter onto span. All right, so let's take a look at that. All right, so we refresh. This is probably a little bit more straightforward. We found all the paragraphs, and then we found the spans in all those paragraphs, but we only wanted the first of those spans. Now, it's not saying the first of all the spans. It's saying the first span in the paragraphs. All right, another kind of a subtle difference. So you might have thought that it would only highlight this, which is this is the first span, but it's actually the first span in all the paragraphs. All right, so again, kind of a subtle difference there with first. Let's take a look at has. Now we saw the has select filter earlier, and the way we did that was we said find all the paragraph tags that have a span, and we used the selector method has, right? And that found the paragraphs. So the paragraphs were the things that we were selecting that had a span in them. Now here we're going to use the has filter on the paragraph and specify the span as the has pattern. Save that. Refresh our browser. Notice we selected the entire paragraph, which is kind of what we suspected. We selected the paragraphs that had spans in them. So this is one that behaves probably a little bit more like what we would expect. We found the paragraphs that has the spans in them and selected those, highlighted them in a different color. All right, so there's the has. One more, and then we'll move on to something a little bit different with our custom select filters. Let's take a look at this colon input, and then I'm going to explain why you shouldn't do this right here. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a colon input. So this is going to find, remember what we said earlier? This is not the input element. This is all inputs. And then we're going to put a border around them. So save this. Let's jump over and see what this looks like in a browser. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about it. All right, so maybe that's not the best color. That's green. Let's make that, well, let's try to make it red. That might show up a little bit better. All right, notice now we've got a red border. Let's do 2 pixels. I want to make sure that shows up so that when you're watching this, you can really see it. All right, maybe that's a little bit better. Notice all input elements, including the select. So here's our select and 2 text boxes. All of those now have the border because they were all inputs, not the element input, because this includes the element input and the element select, but they're all input types, so they all got selected. All right, so that's something to keep in mind about the input filter, is its input types, not just the input element. Now, I said earlier that I'm going to show you why not to do this. Here's why. Remember in the example earlier where I had asterisk and then I specified an attribute on there? All right, and I said don't use the asterisk because that effectively causes us to move into a global scope. And no matter what your selector pattern is, that asterisk is going to cause us to jump all the way out to the entire and include the entire DOM in our search. So this is the same thing as this. There is an implied global if you don't put it. All right, so we want to stay away from globals. The reason why is because, again, we're not limiting our focus. If you've got a really large page and you create either an explicit or an implicit global, then that selector is going to jump all the way out to include the entire DOM, which can be pretty bad performance if you've got a really big page. So keep in mind, avoid this, but this is no better, because if you leave it off, it's an implied global. So a good performance tip there is try to stay away from both implicit and explicit globals. All right, let's go back over to our presentation and let's take a look at where we're at. Well, now we come upon custom selector filters. And custom selector filters, I think, are a lot of fun, because before I realized that you could do custom selector filters, you had to write these filters, and you might have to, they might be kind of convoluted or complex. They didn't make a lot of sense. And there's really not a good way to encapsulate that in a wrapper. And custom selector filters, for me, initially, was really just a wrapper around a complex set of filters, of selectors, that made it a little bit more semantic, if you will. So custom selector filters were kind of like semantic filters to me. So here is what this looks like in order to create a custom selector filter. We're going to specify our JQuery operator, and then we're going to do .expr for expression. We're going to use our colon, all right, because this is going to be our filter specifier is our colon. And then we're going to do we're going to name of the filter, so whatever you want to call your filter goes here. And then we're going to set that equal to a function, because a filter is just a function after all. Remember that most things in JavaScript are functions. And our function is going to take 4 parameters. Our element, an index, some metadata, and then the array, which is the full array of matched elements. And we're simply going to return true or false in that method. True if the filter actually matches what it is we want to match, false otherwise. Let's take a look at what those parameters mean. So element here, or element, is the DOM element being acted upon. So this is the element that we want to test to see if it matches the filter. I is the current index in the array of elements that match our filter. So we understand that in jQuery, when we specify a selector, what we're actually getting back is a jQuery object. It's effectively a collection of things that match our selector filter. So I is the current index of that entire array. So when you run your filter, the filter is run against a resulting set that matches a criteria, that matches a pattern. So I is the index of this element, of the element that we're acting upon within the whole array. Now let's jump down to the 4th parameter, which is array. That is the array. So that's all the matching elements. It might be interesting to have access to all the elements that matched when you want to see if the particular filter can be applied to the element you're looking at. And then finally, match is metadata about that particular selector. And we'll take a look at what that metadata actually is and look at the particular parts of that metadata. All right, so let's take a look at some custom selector filters. Let's jump back over to our code. And the first custom selector filter that we're going to build is going to look like this. So we're going to create a custom selector filter called cheap. And this is going to look for all items that are cheap. All right, in a list of items maybe that cost a certain amount of money. So here's our jQuery operator, .expr, our colon for our filter expression, and then here's the name of our filter, cheap. It's a function that takes our four elements here, and then we're simply going to return parse float. So we're going to float this out, and we're going to look at the value of the particular element that we're testing, and we'll see if it's less than $10. So if it's less than $10, I'm going to consider that cheap. So we're going to parse that out, see if it's less than $10, and return that true or false. Now let's take a look at how we use that. So here is our selector. We're going to find a ID of list t-shirt. Now let's just go down and find that so we know what we're looking at. Here is our select. Here's our select element. It has an ID of list t-shirt, and we can select multiple items in there. It has a particular size, and then we have options. The options have values, which is our monetary values, some descriptions of those, and then we actually list the monetary value in the description. All right, fairly straightforward select element there. So we're going to find that select element, and we're going to find the option that is cheap. And then we're going to mark it as selected. All right, so we're going to set the attribute of selected to be selected. So we're going to find all the cheap options and select them. All right, let's run over to our code and let's refresh this. And there we are. We've selected the two items that are less than $10 in our list, ball cap and keychain, one's $7.95 and one's $3. So we were able to write a custom filter and use it to select certain items based on some rules that we had. So I think that's pretty cool. We can write custom filters, call them whatever we want to. I think that's great. I think that's pretty cool. It has some pretty good opportunities there for us. Let's take things a step further, because I don't like the fact that I had to hard code $10 in my select filter. So I'm going to create a new filter. And this filter is going to be called less than equal to. All right, so this way we can pass, if you get the point there, we're going to be able to pass a value in and check and see if it's less than or equal to that value. So how are we going to do that? Well, here's our parameters coming into our function. We're going to parse float the value of our element and see if it is less than or equal to parse float match 3. All right, so the third item in our match metadata. All right, so this is an array of metadata items, and we're going to look at one of those metadata items and see if our element value is less than or equal to that. So now we're going to figure out how to pass that data in to our filter. So let's take a look at how we would do that. Now I've got some notes here as well that we can take a look at and see exactly what all these elements are. So here is our use of our less than or equal to. We're going to grab the list t-shirt, and we're going to grab all the options that are less than or equal to, and we're going to pass in a value of $18. And then we're going to mark them as selected. Now let's take a look at the elements that are part of this match metadata. The first item in that array is the actual filter. So this is going to be item 1 of match. So this is going to be match 0. This is the actual selector filter with its arguments. The second item in our metadata is just the selector filter. Doesn't have any arguments. Notice it also doesn't have the preceding colon. All right, the second index, the third item, is the actual type of quote used. So single quote versus double quote. All right, in my parameter that I passed in. And last but not least, the index 3, or the fourth element, is the actual argument itself. So these are the meaning of our metadata, and that's also how we pass in our arguments. Notice we're pulling match 3. This is the fourth element, or the third indexed element is our actual value. So we pass that in. Let's save that. Come back over here, refresh our page, and now we've selected everything that is less than or equal to our $18. All right, pretty cool. So now we've got a custom filter, and we can pass data into that custom filter to use in the filter expression when we're actually taking a look at that. So I think that's pretty cool. Okay, now in order to create these particular items here, less than or equal to, I guess you could say, that's pretty open-ended. We could use that in a lot of ways. Cheap, fairly hard-coded, so we'd have to know something about the page. Let's take a look at one that's really open. And as opposed to me trying to write one, James Podolsky has a really nice one. It is a regular expression filter. Let's take a look at this regular expression filter. Now this is, again, I didn't write this. This was written by James Podolsky, and you can go out and just download this. If you look for regular expression filter and James's name, you'll find this, and you can use this in your page. Here's our jQuery operator expression, and he called it regx. Now he comes in here, and he's using the metadata that we're going to pass in, and he's doing some things to actually look and try to match your particular regular expression pattern against the element that you're trying to test against. So this is nice. Let's look at the use of this regular expression custom filter. All right, in this case, we're going to look at all divs, and then we're going to pass in a regular expression here where the class contains 0 to 9, and then we're going to do color and mark it as a particular color. We're going to apply that style. So here is a regular expression custom filter applied in our page, and notice we've changed the style of these three elements. And the way that we did that, let's look back at our actual elements so we can see how that worked. Notice these are ones that contained, where the class contained something from 0 to 9, and it was a div. Here's a div, basic 1. So our class, and we matched a regular expression. That regular expression matched against this number 1. And this div against that number 1. This is a span, so it didn't match. This div against that number 1. So we selected those three divs because their class matched this regular expression. So pretty cool use of the regular expression custom filter. Let's take a look at another use. Again, we used the global here. I wouldn't do this in production. We want to try to stay away from those globals, but for use in the presentation, this works. So we look at everything in the DOM that has a CSS width that begins with 1 to 3. All right, so we're between 1 and 3, and it has 2 digits and has pixels and then end. So this is our regular expression, and we're going to look for everything that has a CSS width that matches that and set its background to something. So let's save that. We're going to refresh our page. All right, and we're finding everything that has a CSS width that matches that pattern. Let's take a look at that. Here's our div here. Let's take a look at one where we're specifying. Here's a good one. This input has a width of 200. So it was selected because that's between 1 and 3 and then 2 digits. So that's 200. So that matched. And all these elements, their width was between 1 and 300. So that's what our regular expression matched. Pretty interesting use of a custom filter with that regular expression matching. All right, last but not least, I want to go into some optimization. HTML5 actually helps us with our JQuery selectors in a couple of ways. I really just kind of want to bring this slide in because it's important to look at how HTML5 helps. Native selector methods were introduced in HTML5. Query Selector and Query Selector All. Now these have actually been supported in the browser for quite some time. And also HTML5 gives us some more semantic tags. More semantic tags means that we can do more tag-based selectors, and tag-based selectors are fairly easy to find. So obviously the easiest selector to find, the most performant, is an ID selector. And the reason why is our jQuery engine will fall back to document.getElementById, which is directly built into the DOM very fast. Then we've got class and element selectors, which are also pretty fast. With more semantic tags, we've got more element selectors that we can use. jQuery Selector and Query Selector All also allow us to use some more DOM-built selectors. So these will use these are actually built into the DOM, so they're very fast, and you can pass a selector into them. So let's take a look at that a little bit. Let's go over to our code, and I'm going to take out this. We're not going to use that anymore. I'm going to come down here to the bottom of the page, and I'm just going to run it at the bottom of the page. That way it will run once the page is loaded. Let's take a look at Query Selector. If we look for all elements, we're going to use document.querySelector. Notice this is a regular selector pattern, UL-LI. So we want to find all, this is a hierarchical selector. We want to find all LI elements in the UL. And then for each one of them, set the class name equal to highlight. So let's refresh our browser. And you can see right here that we selected the first, or we highlighted the first item in our list, which is our navigation elements, and that was using the Query Selector. And we've also got Query Selector All, which is very similar. Query Selector only returns the first one. Query Selector returns them all. So now we're going to do document.querySelector All, same pattern. We're going to loop through them and set their class name to highlight. And there we get all of them equal to our highlighted value. A couple of optimizations we can use here just to make this so that we don't have to do a lookup on length every time. We can set another variable equals to elms.length. So these are things that you should always look for, ways that we can optimize our code. So var I equals 0, m equals elms.length, where I is less than m. We'll do the same thing. So that's kind of an optimization in your loop that you can make. So there is our Query Selector and Query Selector All. One of the things to remember is in browsers that support Query Selector and Query Selector All, so not all browsers select that part of HTML5 yet. In browsers that select that, the Sizzle engine will actually not parse the selector, and it'll pass it on down to the DOM, to the native Query Selector or Query Selector All. So it's extremely fast. So in a browser that supports them, it will use by default jQuery Selector and jQuery Selector All. Alright, so that's just a little bit about how HTML5 can help. So what's the important stuff around performance with jQuery selectors? The first thing is to optimize your selectors to descend from an ID if possible. So that's just saying start with an ID. And the reason why is because the IDs automatically go out to document.getElementById, which is DOM level, very, very fast. Now with HTML5, we can extend that statement to say optimize selectors to descend from either an ID, or if your browser supports Query Selector or Query Selector All, use patterns that will be supported by those two methods. All that goes to the DOM and is very fast. Selectors are read from right to left. Now this changed with the implementation of Sizzle as the jQuery selector engine. We're going to come back to that. I want to look at an example of that. Use tag names when possible, because that, when you use a tag name, that falls back to the DOM level method, getElementsByTagName. Alright, so that's also very fast because it's done at the DOM level. Don't be too specific in your selector. We'll take a look at an example of that real quickly. Remember we said avoid explicit and implicit global selectors. and cache the selectors. So if you're going to have to look for the same element over and over again, look for it once, save it into a variable, and then use that out of the variable each time, as opposed to having to engage the selector engine and parse through the DOM every time. Alright, let's take a look at a couple of those things we mentioned. The first thing that we want to look at is this. If we look for a div and then look for anything in that div that has an ID of data table, then look for a table, then look for anything in that table, maybe a cell that has a right class, we can do that. But a better way to optimize that would be take the more specific elements you have on the left and make the right hand side more specific, because Sizzle reads from right to left. So instead, let's make this more specific. We change this to td.right. Now it's more specific. And then table, and then pound data table. More specific on the right, and then work your way over. Now, we also don't want to be too specific. So we don't really need this table. As long as we're looking in data table, we're going to find all TDs that have a class of right. The table is extraneous, so we can remove it. A further optimization. Now, obviously, you want to look for data table IDs first. Doing this becomes a selector that has to be parsed by the jQuery, by some kind of parser engine. If instead we do this, that allows us to go out to the DOM level method, get element by ID very fast, then simply do find td.right. We don't have as large or as complex of a selector pattern to have to parse. This actually can be a lot faster than this, because you've gone to an ID which is more specific and then done a find on that using your element. So this is a good pattern to go through that will allow us to take a selector which works just fine and optimize it by making being more specific on the right, pulling out extraneous values, and then look and see if you can have everything kind of start from a div or from an ID, and that gets you your most optimal query. Okay. So we looked at how to optimize selectors to descend from an ID. All right, that was our last step. Read from right to left, be more specific on the right than the left. Use IDs or tag names when possible. Don't be too specific. Get rid of those extraneous elements so that your selector is less parsing has to be done on it. Avoid those explicit and implicit global selectors, and cache selectors if you're going to use them more than once. Well, I hope that you've gotten some stuff out of the presentation. I hope that you've got some things that you'll be able to use right away. I hope that you'll also take away some of the optimization techniques to look at some of your existing selectors and be able to optimize those. Feel free to send me an email if you've got any questions. I'd be glad to answer them if I can, and hopefully you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.